14 graves sit beneath the old magnolia trees at Riverside Plantation. No headstones. No names. No dates. Just shallow dips in the earth that never fully disappeared, as if the land itself refused to forget. For more than 100 years, rain fell, roots grew, and time passed, yet those 14 places never flattened. They remained like quiet scars, waiting for someone to notice. In 1891, a land surveyor named Thomas Hartwell did exactly that. Hartwell was hired to map the boundaries of Riverside Plantation, a property long abandoned and slowly being reclaimed by nature. He was a practical man, trained to trust numbers, measurements, and soil. He had no interest in ghost stories or local rumors. But on his second day working near a grove of magnolia trees, his tools told him something was wrong. The soil in that area was disturbed. Not randomly, but carefully. 14 separate spots. All the same length. All the same depth. All facing the same direction. When Hartwell ran his metal detector over the ground, it reacted sharply. Iron lay beneath the surface. Chains. Broken links. Rusted rings. These were not old family graves. These were not victims of disease or war buried in haste. Hartwell calculated the spacing and the settling of the soil and came to a chilling conclusion. All 14 graves had been dug and filled on the same night. The question haunted him. Why would 14 people be buried in secret at once? The answer did not lie in the year 1891. It lay decades earlier, in the final years before the Civil War, when Riverside Plantation was alive with cotton fields, human suffering, and a choice that would echo through time. That story begins in the spring of 1854. Samuel Brennan arrived at Riverside Plantation with hope in his heart and ambition in his mind. He was 32 years old, the son of a successful Charleston shipping merchant who had left him a sizable inheritance. Samuel knew trade. He knew profit. He knew numbers. What he did not know was farming, or power over human lives. Riverside Plantation stretched across 800 acres along the Cooper River. The land was rich but neglected. The previous owner, Charles Dunmore, had died without heirs, and the plantation had slowly decayed during years of legal dispute. That decay made the property affordable. It also hid its history. Samuel traveled with his wife Margaret and their young daughter Eleanor. When their carriage turned onto the long, broken road leading to the main house, Margaret felt her excitement fade. The house was large but worn down. Paint peeled from the shutters. The white columns had turned gray. Vines crawled up the walls like fingers claiming what was left behind. Inside, dust coated everything. Furniture lay hidden under sheets. Water stains spread across the ceiling. Rats had made homes where people once gathered. Margaret walked room to room, her worry growing with every step. "This place will take months to fix," she said quietly. Samuel tried to sound confident. "We have time. And we have workers." The word hung heavy in the air. 32 enslaved people came with the land. Their names were listed in the purchase documents like tools or animals. Samuel had seen them from a distance before buying the plantation. He had not spoken to them. He had not looked them in the eyes. To him, they were part of the operation, not individuals. Margaret felt the weight of that truth. She had grown up in Charleston, where slavery was common, but this was different. Owning a household servant was not the same as owning an entire community. She had warned Samuel. He had promised fairness. But fairness inside an unfair system is a promise that cannot last. That evening, as the sun dipped below the river, Samuel stood on the porch and admired. His land. Fields waiting to be reborn. A future waiting to be built. He did not notice the people watching him from the shadows near the quarters. 5 figures stood quietly. 3 older men. 2 women. They watched their new master the way prey watches a new hunter. Among them was Henry, the plantation overseer. He had been born at Riverside. He knew every tree, every path, every hidden place. He had survived under Dunmore by being useful, careful, and quiet. Now he studied Samuel Brennan. The man is young, Henry said softly to the woman beside him. Her name was Judith, and she ran the kitchen. Young men think they are kind until power tests them. Is he better than the last one? She asked. Henry paused. Anyone would be better than Dunmore. But that does not mean safe. None of them knew yet what would be demanded of them. None of them knew about the choice that would come. About the moment when survival would no longer be the only thing that mattered. Samuel woke before dawn the next morning. The plantation was alive with sounds he had never known. Frogs croaked along the river. An owl called from the trees. Somewhere in the distance, someone coughed. He dressed quickly and went outside. Henry was already awake, handing out tools and giving instructions. His small house stood between the main house and the quarters, a place chosen for control. He greeted Samuel with a nod. Figured you would want to see everything, Mr. Brennan. I do, Samuel said. Show me all of it. They walked the land as the sun rose. Henry explained the fields, the good soil, the bad soil, the mistakes Dunmore had made. He spoke calmly, but his words carried quiet warnings. In the west fields, Dunmore had forced work even when floodwaters stood knee-deep. Lost 3 people to fever, Henry said. Samuel noticed the way he said it. Lost. Not killed. Not sacrificed. Just lost. Samuel did not yet understand that Riverside Plantation was already marked by death. He did not yet know that the land remembered everything. He was still standing at the beginning of a path that would end beneath the magnolia trees. And the 14 graves were already waiting. If you want to hear what happens next, make sure to subscribe to the channel, share this story with others, and leave your thoughts in the comments. Part 2 will reveal the crisis that forced an impossible choice and set the stage for a night the land would never forget. Part 2. 14 bare patches of earth sat beneath the magnolia trees, quiet and patient. To a child, they looked like a puzzle. To the land itself, they were a memory that refused to fade. Eleanor Brennan knelt in the cool shade, her small fingers pressing into soil that felt different from the rest of the plantation. It was looser, softer, as if it had been turned not long ago, even though no one had worked here for years. She did not know what graves were yet. She only knew that the grass refused to grow. Behind her, Ruth Campbell stood silently, leaning on her stick, watching the child with an expression filled with something between sorrow and fear. Do you know why the grass does not grow here? Eleanor asked again, her voice gentle and curious. Ruth did not answer right away. Her eyes moved from the child to the ground and then up to the magnolia branches above them. The leaves whispered softly in the breeze, a sound like quiet voices speaking all at once. Some places remember things, Ruth said finally. Things the people try to forget. Eleanor frowned. Places can remember. Yes, child, better than people do. Ruth gently guided Eleanor back toward the main house, her hand firm but kind on the girl's shoulder. She did not explain more. Some truths, she knew, were not meant for children. And some truths were dangerous for anyone to speak out loud. That evening, Samuel Brennan sat at his desk again, staring at the plantation ledgers by lamplight. The numbers were clear, but the story they told made no sense. The 10 days in July of 1850 still bothered him. No cotton recorded, no expenses, no notes. Then suddenly payments to a doctor and a minister. Materials, services, and one final line written in Charles Dunmore's sharp hand. 14 deceased. 14 who? Samuel muttered to himself. The next morning, he asked Henry to join him in the office. Henry stood quietly as Samuel pointed to the ledger. Do you remember July of 1850? Henry's face did not change, but something behind his eyes did. A door closed. A wall went up. That was before my time as overseer in name only, sir, Henry said carefully. I was still under Dunmore then. But you were here. Yes, sir. 14 people died. Samuel pressed. Henry's jaw tightened. Yes, sir. How? Henry hesitated. Fever, accidents, exhaustion. Different causes. All at once. Henry did not answer immediately. Outside the office, the sounds of work drifted in. Tools striking wood. Voices calling across the yard. Life continuing. Mr. Brennan, Henry said slowly, some questions do not make a plantation run better. Samuel leaned back in his chair. Some questions need answers anyway. Henry met his eyes. That may be so, but answers have a cost. Samuel dismissed him, unsettled by the warning. While Samuel searched records and Margaret oversaw repairs, life at Riverside followed its routines. Cotton fields demanded labor. Cabins needed patching. Meals had to be cooked. But beneath the surface, something had shifted. The people watched Samuel closely. His refusal to work flooded fields had been noticed. His interest in old records had been noticed too. Grace spoke to Henry that night as the quarters settled into quiet. He's asking questions, she said. Henry nodded. I know. Does he deserve the truth? Henry looked toward the magnolia grove, barely visible in the moonlight. That depends on whether he is strong enough to carry it. The truth lived not just in ledgers or land, but in memory. And memory belonged most clearly to Ruth Campbell. Ruth had been young once. She had been strong once. In 1850, she had been a mother of two and a woman who believed endurance was the only path to survival. Until endurance was no longer enough. It began with Dunmore's new cotton contract. Prices had risen. Expectations had risen with them. Work hours stretched longer. Food portions shrank. Sick people were forced into the fields. Punishments became public and cruel. Henry had not been overseer then. Another man had held that position. A man who believed fear was the fastest way to profit. 14 people reached their breaking point together. They met in secret beneath the magnolias, chosen because Dunmore never walked there. The soil had already been marked by death before them, older burials from generations past. It felt like a place where the living and the dead listened closely. They talked about running, about resisting, about refusing to work, and they talked about something else. Choice. They knew what refusal would bring. Chains, whips, slow deaths. They had seen it happen before. But they also knew what obedience meant. Watching children starve. Watching bodies break. Watching dignity be ground into dirt. 14 people chose the only freedom they believed remained. Ruth had begged her husband not to be part of it. He had kissed her forehead and told her he was tired of living without being alive. On a night without moonlight, 14 souls ended their lives beneath the magnolias. Not in panic, not in chaos, but together. Dunmore panicked when the bodies were found. He called a doctor to confirm death. A minister to say prayers. He paid for chains to weigh the bodies down. He ordered the graves dug quickly and quietly. He told the others that silence was survival. And silence held for 40 years. Until a curious man arrived. Until a curious child knelt in the dirt. Until questions were asked that could not be buried again. Ruth finished her memory and stared at Eleanor sleeping peacefully in her bed that night. The child had asked an innocent question. And the land had answered by remembering. The story of Riverside Plantation was no longer asleep. If you want to hear what happens next, subscribe to the channel, share this story, and leave your thoughts in the comments. Part 3 will reveal how Samuel Brennan confronts the truth and how the plantation responds when buried history begins to breathe again. Part 3. The magnolia grove waited silently, its branches swaying in the evening breeze. It had seen everything and remembered more than anyone living dared to speak. And tonight, it would speak through Ruth. Samuel Brennan approached cautiously. The sky was painted with fire and shadow, a warning or a promise, he couldn't tell which. Ruth sat on a weathered log, snapping green beans into a bowl, her movements slow and deliberate. She did not look up immediately. She had been expecting him. Ruth, he said softly, I need to understand. I need to know what happened in July of 1850. She set the bowl aside, her fingers brushing the worn wood. The shadows of the magnolia leaves stretched across her face, making the lines deeper, the age heavier. She didn't speak for a long moment, as if weighing not just words, but time itself. You really want to know? Ruth asked finally. Because once you hear it, there is no forgetting. I need to know, Samuel said. I can't manage this plantation properly if I don't understand what's been buried here. She nodded slowly, her gaze drifting to the dark patches of earth just beyond the grove. 14 spots, she counted silently. 14 people, their memory lives here, in this soil, and in me. It began with the heat, Ruth said, her voice low. The cotton fields were unforgiving that summer. The sun was relentless, the soil hard where it should have been soft, water scarce in places it should have run freely. People fell ill faster than the overseers could notice. Men, women, children. Some survived, others did not. She paused, looking at Samuel. But that was not all. The sickness, the heat, the work, it was the final test of endurance. Because what happened next was not a sickness of the body, but of the spirit. The master, Dunmore, wanted cotton at any cost. People had been dying before, slowly, quietly, and still he demanded more. Work until collapse, until fever, until exhaustion made them nothing but bodies in the fields. That summer, they realized they could endure no more. Who are we, Ruth said, if survival means we are no longer human? Samuel swallowed hard. I understand. But how did 14 people die at once? Ruth's eyes darkened. It was a choice, she said. They had worked, suffered, begged for mercy, and been refused. They could continue to labor under impossible conditions and hope for life, or they could make a choice. A choice about how to live, how to die, and how much dignity they would allow themselves to surrender. The night they made that choice, she continued, the plantation was quiet. The fields had been emptied of the living, and the grove became their sanctuary. One by one, they spoke about what they could no longer bear. Chains, whips, disease, hunger, the slow theft of every ounce of their humanity. It was not a rash decision. It was a deliberate one. They were leaving the world on their own terms because every other term had been stolen from them. Samuel felt a chill creep over him. I can't imagine such a thing. Ruth's hand brushed the earth beside her. Neither could we, she said. Not fully, but I witnessed it. I held some of their hands. I prayed for them. I tried to stay strong when there was nothing left to stay strong for. They were buried here, Ruth said, lifting her eyes to meet his. No markers, no ceremony that the master sanctioned. Only me to remember them. Only the land itself to hold their story. And yet, Samuel said slowly, you have told me now. You are sharing it. Yes, Ruth said. Because someone must. Because someone has to know. Because otherwise, their lives are forgotten, even in death. He nodded, the weight of understanding pressing down on him. He could feel the centuries of cruelty compressed into this grove, and in those bare patches of earth, the ghosts of 14 souls waited silently. Ruth stood, leaning heavily on her stick. I can tell you more, she said. About who they were, what they loved, what they feared. But the full story, you may not want to hear it all at once. Samuel shook his head. I need to know everything, Ruth. Not to judge, not to punish, but to understand. She studied him, measuring his resolve. Finally, she nodded. Then you must be prepared. The story is not of numbers, nor of records, nor even of cotton. It is of choice, of dignity, and of consequences no one in this world should ever have to face. Ruth gestured toward the 14 bare patches in the grove. These graves, she said quietly, are more than dirt and shadows. They are memory. They are proof that even in the worst circumstances, people can make choices that claim the only freedom left to them. Samuel walked slowly toward the grove, the soil soft beneath his boots. He could see Eleanor's small flowers scattered across the graves, a 5-year-old's act of remembrance bridging decades of silence. He knelt beside the patches, and for the first time, truly felt the lives that had been lost. Ruth's voice followed him softly, like a prayer or a warning. Remember them. Remember every name, every smile, every song they ever sang, because no ledger, no master, no plantation can erase who they were. And then she added, a warning sharpened by decades of pain. Do not forget that even though the choice they made was theirs, it came from a place of desperation. That is the part that will make your heart ache. That is the part the world would prefer you never know. Samuel rose, his mind full of questions, his heart heavy with understanding. He looked back at Ruth, grateful and solemn. Thank you, he said, for sharing this with me. For trusting me. Ruth nodded once, sharply. Trust is earned, she said. You may not fully understand yet. But you will. The sun slipped behind the trees, leaving the grove in shadow, and for the first time, the land seemed alive with memory. It had waited 100 years for someone willing to see it, willing to remember. If you want to follow the rest of the story, make sure to subscribe to the channel, share this tale with others, and leave your thoughts in the comments. Part 4 will reveal how the plantation begins to change when its buried history is confronted and what unexpected consequences ripple through Riverside. Part 4. The grove seemed alive that morning. The air smelled of damp earth and magnolia blossoms, a heavy sweetness that clung to Samuel's skin as he walked among the 14 bare patches. The soil no longer seemed empty. It seemed to watch, to wait, to remember. Ruth was already there, seated on her familiar log, hands folded in her lap. She looked at Samuel without speaking, as if she had been expecting him for hours. Eleanor was nearby, collecting flowers to place carefully on each patch, her small face serious and determined. Samuel stopped beside Ruth and took a deep breath. I want to know everything, he said. No more omissions. No more hesitation. I need to understand what happened here. Ruth's eyes softened at Eleanor, and then she turned her attention fully to Samuel. Very well, she said. But this story is not easy to hear. It is not easy to see, and it will not leave your heart untouched. It began with hope, Ruth said. A small hope, fragile and bright, that the summer of 1850 would pass like any other. But the hope was quickly crushed. The rains had failed early that year. The fields were dry in some places, flooded in others. The overseer forced the workers to labor through fever, through exhaustion, through blistering heat. People collapsed in the sun, coughing, sweating, sometimes screaming, and the cries were ignored. Samuel felt his stomach tighten. I've read the records, he said quietly. 14 deceased. All at once. Ruth nodded. Not by accident. Not by disease alone. By choice. He could barely breathe. Choice. How could anyone choose to die? You must understand, Ruth said. They were not free. They were not protected. Every day was a calculation of survival and obedience. But survival without dignity is not really living. Who were they? Samuel asked. Ruth looked toward the bare earth again. Joseph, Diana, Marcus, Anna, Grace. All of them. People with families, hopes, and fears. Joseph loved to sing even when the sun burned down on him. Diana braided hair in patterns that made the children smile. Marcus carved small wooden animals. Anna tended the sick when no one else would. And Grace, brave and clever, kept the smallest children safe when she could. Why would they choose death? Samuel whispered. Because the master demanded it, Ruth said. Because the work was endless, the suffering constant, and the chance for relief non-existent. Because sometimes, when the world offers nothing but chains, the only freedom left is in choosing your own ending. Ruth's voice cracked as she spoke, but she steadied herself. They planned it together, she said. They met at night, in secret. They spoke quietly, sharing their fears, their wishes, their goodbyes. They knew what would happen, and they accepted it. Not out of madness, but out of courage. Out of a refusal to be treated as less than human. Samuel felt a cold weight settle on his shoulders. He had never imagined this. Not as a ledger, not as a plantation owner, not as a human being. He looked down at the earth and saw Eleanor's small offerings, the bright flowers laid on bare soil like tiny flags of remembrance. Did anyone else know? He asked. Only a few, Ruth said. Henry knew. I knew. And I tried to keep it quiet, to protect the others from punishment and shame. But the memory never faded. It lives here, in the soil, in the trees, in us. Samuel knelt beside the first patch. He pressed his fingers lightly against the earth, and it felt strange, almost alive. He thought of the people who had once worked the land, who had loved and suffered and finally chosen their own fate. Could I have done anything? He asked softly. Ruth shook her head. No one could have. Not then, not under those conditions. It was a choice that belonged to them alone. The only thing you can do now is remember them. Honor them. Treat their story with care. Samuel's mind swirled with images he could barely imagine. He thought of Eleanor, so young, laying her flowers, carrying memory like a quiet shield. He thought of Ruth, the weight of years and silence written on her face. And he thought of the 14 souls beneath the magnolias, brave in a way he could never measure. Ruth leaned back against the log, exhausted by the memory. You cannot hurry grief, she said. You cannot rush understanding. You can only let it settle, as the soil does after rain, and learn from it. From that day forward, Samuel's view of Riverside Plantation began to change. He walked the fields differently, noticing the faces of the workers, listening to their quiet words, observing the small acts of care and resistance. He began to understand that the land was not just cotton and soil, but memory and struggle, hope and despair intertwined. Eleanor continued her visits to the grove, guided by Ruth, laying flowers, whispering names, asking questions that Ruth answered in measured doses. The workers noticed her devotion, and some began to share small stories of the people who had gone before, as if Eleanor's innocence had opened a small window for memory to breathe again. Margaret watched from the house, torn between fear and admiration. Her daughter's attention to the grove was unsettling, a reminder that history could not be erased. Yet there was something healing in it as well. Something human. Samuel realized that understanding the past did not make him weak. It made him responsible. The plantation, the people, the land, they all demanded accountability. He could no longer think in terms of profit alone. He had to act with conscience. And so the work of remembering began. The plantation's routines continued, but beneath the labor and the sun, a quiet transformation took place. Respect replaced fear in small gestures. Stories returned in whispers. Flowers grew where bare soil had waited for a century. Ruth finally rose from the log, leaning heavily on her stick. Samuel followed her gaze toward the horizon. Do not forget, she said. The past has teeth. It bites if ignored, but it also teaches if honored. Samuel nodded, feeling the truth of her words settle in his chest. Riverside was no longer just land and labor. It was a place of stories, of courage, of decisions that no one should have had to make. And it was his responsibility to bear witness. If you want to see how Riverside's story unfolds and what happens when the past cannot be ignored, subscribe to the channel, share this story with others, and leave your thoughts in the comments. Part 5 will reveal the ripple effects of the summer of 1850, the ways the living are haunted by the choices of those buried beneath the magnolias, and the secrets that refuse to stay hidden. Part 5. The sun had barely risen when a strange quiet fell over Riverside Plantation. The fields glimmered with dew, but there was something heavier in the air, a tension that even the birds seemed to notice. The grove of magnolias stood silently, their shadows long and dark across the bare patches of earth. 14 graves, still unmarked, still waiting, still remembering. Samuel Brennan walked slowly toward the grove that morning. His heart was heavy with what Ruth had told him. 14 lives ended together. 14 acts of courage born from suffering that no ledger could measure. And yet, he knew that the story was only beginning to touch the living. Eleanor was already there, kneeling in the dirt with small flowers in her hands. She hummed softly, a tune Joseph had once sung, or at least Ruth said he had. It was a song of hope, and of memory. Eleanor had begun to understand, in the simple, clear way only a child can, that remembrance could be its own kind of justice. Ruth watched from the edge of the grove. She had shared the story with Samuel in pieces, carefully, and now she allowed Eleanor to participate in her own small way. The child's presence was a bridge, a reminder that history could not stay buried forever. Samuel joined them quietly. He knelt beside a patch of bare earth, feeling the weight of time and suffering in the soft soil. Each grave was a story. Each patch was a life. And he realized that even with understanding, he could not undo what had been done. The ripple of that night in 1850 had not stayed in the past. Ruth had kept the memory alive, but the people who survived had carried it in silence, in habits, in the way they moved through the fields, the way they answered questions, the way they avoided certain topics. And now, with Eleanor and Samuel paying attention, the past began to reach out again. That morning, Henry came to check on the workers. He noticed something different, a subtle shift in the energy of Riverside. The people were still working, still careful, but there was a spark, almost imperceptible, in their eyes. They were watching Samuel differently, listening more closely, feeling that perhaps, for the first time, they could speak without fear. Henry approached Samuel later in the day. The overseer's face was serious, as it always was, but there was a tension beneath the surface that Samuel had not seen before. "You've opened something," he said. "Be careful." "I intend to be careful," Samuel replied. "But I will not turn away from what needs to be known." Henry nodded slowly. "There are stories that the land itself cannot forget," he said. "You have started to listen, and that is dangerous, and yet necessary." Meanwhile, Eleanor returned to the main house for lunch. Margaret noticed the dirt on her dress and frowned. She still did not understand the importance of the grove, and she feared the influence it might have on her daughter. Eleanor looked up at her mother with clear eyes. "Mother," she said, "these people deserve to be remembered. I am helping them." Margaret did not know what to say. She understood the sentiment, but she feared what acknowledgement of the past might do to their fragile sense of safety and control over the plantation. That evening, Samuel called a meeting with the key workers, including Henry, Judith, and Ruth. He wanted to discuss plans for the summer, planting schedules, repairs, and labor distribution. But the meeting inevitably drifted toward the subject of the past, toward the summer of 1850, toward the truths that had long been avoided. Samuel spoke carefully. "I know what happened here," he said. "I know the history, and I want to do things differently. I want to honor those who came before. I want the plantation to be a place where people are respected, where dignity matters." Ruth's face was unreadable. Henry's jaw tightened. Judith looked down at her hands. There was silence. "We cannot undo what happened," Ruth said finally. "But we can make sure it is not repeated. We can teach respect, demand fairness, and recognize the humanity of everyone here." Samuel nodded. "That is exactly what I intend to do." It was a beginning, but beginnings are fragile. There were tensions he could not see, histories he could not fully comprehend, and consequences he had yet to face. The grove had reminded him that memory is powerful, and memory can be dangerous. Over the following weeks, Eleanor continued her visits to the Magnolia Grove. She began to talk to the surviving workers, learning small pieces of life that had been lived in secret. Joseph's love of song, Diana's skill with braiding, Marcus's carvings, Anna's knowledge of herbs, Grace's bravery. Each story brought color and humanity to the soil beneath the trees. Samuel noticed subtle changes across the plantation. Workers who had remained silent began to speak more freely to one another. Work moved more smoothly. The children laughed in ways that had been rare before. Riverside, once a place of fear and routine, began to breathe with life again. But the shadow of the past remained. Every conversation, every decision, every glance toward the grove reminded Samuel that the choices made in 1850 were not abstract events. They were alive in the memory of those who had survived, and in the soil itself. The land remembered. The people remembered. One afternoon, as Samuel walked toward the grove, he noticed Ruth standing quietly among the magnolias, her hands clasped over her chest. She looked older, more fragile, yet her eyes were sharp, clear, and unyielding. She gestured for him to come closer. "There are things," she said softly, "that you must see, things that cannot be conveyed through words alone. The past is not a story to be told from a distance. You must witness it." Samuel nodded. He felt the weight of responsibility, of history, of lives lost and lives endured. He understood, finally, that Riverside Plantation was not just land and labor. It was memory. It was legacy. It was courage and suffering intertwined, refusing to be ignored. The magnolia grove seemed to lean in, as if acknowledging his understanding, as if accepting his promise. 14 bare patches of earth waited, patient and still, for recognition. For remembrance. For justice in the simplest form, attention and respect. If you want to follow the rest of Riverside's story, subscribe to the channel, share this story with others, and leave your thoughts in the comments. Part 6 will reveal how confronting the past begins to reshape the present, how memory collides with daily life on the plantation, and how the living carry the echoes of choices that can never be forgotten. Part 6. The night air at Riverside Plantation was thick and heavy, carrying the scent of magnolia and damp earth. Shadows stretched across the fields, long and dark, like fingers reaching for the living. The magnolia grove waited silently at the edge of the property, its secrets pressed deep into the soil. 14 graves, bare and unmarked, remembered every sound, every choice, every moment of courage and despair. Samuel Brennan walked slowly toward the grove, lantern in hand, his steps quiet on the packed dirt. Eleanor had begged to come along, but he had insisted she stay inside. Some truths, he realized, were too heavy for a 5-year-old to carry all at once. And yet, he wanted her to understand eventually. He wanted her to grow up knowing that memory and respect mattered, even when the world tried to bury them. Ruth was waiting for him, her walking stick planted firmly in the earth, eyes sharp in the lantern light. She looked smaller than he remembered, fragile with age, but there was an authority in her presence that demanded attention. "Tonight," she said, "you will understand more than before." Samuel nodded. He felt a knot in his chest tighten as he took in the 14 patches of bare earth. He had walked among them in daylight, but night cast a different weight. Shadows fell across the soil in patterns that made the graves seem alive, as if they were breathing quietly beneath the surface. "Tell me," he said. "I am ready to hear it all." Ruth's lips pressed together for a long moment. She finally exhaled slowly. "It is not a story for comfort," she said. "The summer of 1850 was the summer we learned how little the world could care for us, how thin the line between life and death could be." She gestured to the grove. "These trees saw everything," Ruth said. "The sweat, the pain, the despair. They also saw courage. Do you understand courage, Samuel?" "I think I am beginning to," he said. "It started with the heat," she explained. "The sun burned relentlessly, the fields cracked and baked under its glare. Water was scarce, and those who labored long hours in the cotton rows fell ill one by one. Fever and exhaustion moved through the workers like a silent predator, claiming strength with every passing day. Samuel swallowed hard. "And the master?" he asked. Dunmore did not care, Ruth said. He measured only cotton and profit. He demanded labor beyond reason, beyond endurance. Some people collapsed in the fields. Some begged for relief. Some simply tried to hide, to rest, to survive. All were ignored. "So, they made a choice," Samuel said quietly, almost afraid to voice it. Ruth nodded. "A terrible choice. But it was the only choice left to them. If survival meant surrendering everything that made them human, they would not survive as people. And so they chose death, on their own terms." Samuel felt a cold weight settle in his chest. How could they decide that? How could they bear it? They spoke together at night, Ruth continued. In whispers, in shared understanding. They held hands, they prayed, they comforted each other. Each knew what would happen, each accepted the consequences. There was no panic, no madness, only resolve. They chose dignity when the world had offered none. And then, Ruth said softly, they were gone. The lantern flickered in Samuel's hand as he stared at the soil. He wanted to imagine it differently, wanted to think there had been some other way, but he could not. He could feel the weight of the summer in the quiet, in the soil, in the trees themselves. "You must remember," Ruth said. "Not because it will be easy, but because it is right. Because forgetting is what allows cruelty to survive." Samuel knelt beside a patch of earth. He traced the outline with his fingers. Joseph, Diana, Marcus, Anna, Grace. Names that meant something again because someone remembered. Because Eleanor laid flowers. Because Ruth spoke their story. "Memory is power," Ruth said. "The land remembers, the people remember. And those who survive carry the echoes in their hearts, whether they want or not." Samuel felt the weight of responsibility settle heavily on his shoulders. He could not change what happened. He could not return life to the 14. But he could change what happened next. He could ensure that Riverside became a place of respect, dignity, and memory. And he would start by listening, Ruth said. Truly listening. To the workers, to the children, to the land itself. Every story matters. Every life matters. Even those long gone. That night, Samuel stayed in the grove longer than he realized. He traced each bare patch, spoke the names aloud, and tried to feel the courage of those who had made the choice. He could not understand it fully, but he could honor it. And that was the only way forward. The next morning, life at Riverside began to shift. Samuel called the workers together and spoke honestly, in a way he never had before. He acknowledged the past, spoke of respect, and promised change. The workers listened quietly, their eyes wary but attentive. Small gestures followed. Conversations began. Trust, tentative and fragile, started to grow. Eleanor continued her visits, now carrying small sketches she had made of the people Ruth had described. She asked questions, listened, and laid flowers. Ruth guided her, telling her what could be said, what could be remembered. The child's innocence and curiosity became a bridge, connecting the living with the past in a way no adult could. Margaret, hesitant but observing, began to see the value in acknowledgement. Though she did not fully understand, she could not deny the change it brought. Riverside was waking, slowly, to memory, to humanity, to life that had been suppressed too long. Yet the shadow of 1850 lingered. Every glance toward the grove, every conversation, every thought of that summer reminded Samuel that the past is never truly gone. The choices of the dead echo through the living, shaping everything in subtle, powerful ways. And Ruth, leaning on her stick at the edge of the grove, reminded him constantly that memory carries responsibility. We remember, she said. We honor, we act. That is the only way to survive a history this dark. If you want to continue the story of Riverside Plantation, subscribe to the channel, share this story with others, and leave your thoughts in the comments. Part 7 will reveal the consequences of confronting the past more directly, the challenges Samuel faces as he works to honor memory while navigating a plantation still shaped by fear, and the unexpected ways the living are haunted by choices made long ago. Part 7. The wind stirred through Riverside Plantation that night, carrying a chill that seemed older than the house itself. The magnolia grove stood in the shadows, dark and silent, as if it were holding its breath. 14 bare patches of earth waited, patient and solemn, holding the memory of the lives that had been taken and the courage that had been shown. Samuel Brennan stood at the edge of the grove, lantern in hand. The memory of Ruth's story weighed on him, heavier than any ledger, heavier than any crop failure or financial calculation. He could feel it pressing against his chest, demanding recognition, demanding respect, demanding action. Something happened here, he whispered, more to himself than anyone else. Something terrible, and I have to make it right. Ruth appeared silently, as she often did, leaning on her stick. Her eyes were sharp in the dim light. She has been waiting for you, she said. Waiting for you to understand that the past is never finished. Samuel nodded. I understand that now. I cannot change what happened, but I can ensure it is remembered. I can ensure it is honored. And that is why we must act carefully, Ruth said. There are consequences in memory, consequences in acknowledgement. Some things hidden in fear can remain peaceful. Others, when brought to light, stir the living in ways they cannot control. The very next morning, Samuel gathered the workers at the quarters. He wanted to speak honestly, to confront the legacy of fear and silence that had shaped Riverside for so many years. He knew it would be delicate. He knew that every word mattered. I know the summer of 1850 was hard, he began. I know that people suffered, that lives were taken, that choices were forced. I want you to know that I will not continue that legacy. I will not demand work that endangers life. I will not ignore suffering. I want Riverside to be a place of dignity and respect. The workers listened in silence. Some faces were skeptical, some eyes were wary, but there was something in Samuel's tone, something in his expression, that made them pause. Ruth stood nearby, silent but watchful. She could see the small flicker of change beginning, the first ripple of possibility. But she also knew the past was heavy, and trust was fragile. Over the following weeks, Samuel implemented small changes. He improved access to water in the fields. He ensured shade and rest for the laborers during the hottest parts of the day. He consulted with Anna about herbal remedies, giving her the space and respect to care for the sick. Gradually, he could see the difference. The workers moved with slightly more ease. Laughter returned in small doses. Conversations were held in whispers at first, then with more confidence. Riverside was breathing again, cautiously, but breathing. Yet the shadow of 1850 remained. Every mention of the summer, every reference to the missing records, every glance toward the grove reminded Samuel that the past was alive, and it was watching him. The land remembered, the people remembered, and those who had endured the unimaginable still carried echoes of it in their bodies and in their habits. Eleanor continued her visits to the grove, her small hands placing flowers with care. She listened as Ruth shared stories of Joseph's songs, Diana's braids, Marcus's carvings, and Grace's bravery. Each story was a bridge to the past, a link that made the dead human again. The living began to speak quietly of the people they had known, their eyes softening with recognition and grief. But not everyone welcomed the acknowledgement. Margaret remained hesitant. She could not fully understand why Eleanor spent so much time at the grove, why Ruth told stories that disturbed the household's comfort. She feared that opening old wounds would bring unrest, that it would invite rebellion or chaos. And yet, even she could not deny the small changes she observed. The workers were calmer, more willing to engage, and the plantation ran more smoothly than it had under Dunmore's harsh rule. One afternoon, Samuel returned to the grove alone. He knelt beside the patches of earth, tracing the edges with his fingers. The soil felt alive, full of memory. He whispered the names aloud. Joseph, Diana, Marcus, Anna, Grace. He tried to imagine the courage it had taken for them to choose dignity over mere survival. Suddenly, he felt a movement behind him. Henry had come without announcement. The overseer's face was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes that Samuel had never seen before: recognition, respect, and a quiet warning. "You are doing what must be done," Henry said. "But remember this: the past does not rest easily. It watches, it waits, and sometimes, it tests the living." Samuel nodded. "I understand. I am prepared to face whatever comes," he said. The following days brought challenges. Some of the younger workers tested the new rules, pushing boundaries to see if Samuel truly meant what he said. Others, still cautious, held back, unsure if the acknowledgement of the past could change their present. Samuel navigated these tensions carefully, listening, observing, and acting with fairness. One evening, Ruth approached him in the main house, her face pale in the candlelight. "There is one more thing," she said quietly. "Something you must understand about courage and consequence. Something that still binds this place." She told him about the letters that had been hidden, messages exchanged in secret among those who had survived the summer of 1850. Letters of warning, letters of grief, letters of instruction for the living. They were buried or hidden, intended to guide those who remained. Samuel listened in silence, realizing that Riverside was more than land and labor. It was history, memory, and moral responsibility intertwined. And if he failed to act with care, if he ignored the echoes of the past, he could dishonor those who had given everything to preserve their dignity. That night, Samuel stood once more in the magnolia grove. Lantern light danced across the soil, shadows stretching like hands over the bare patches. 14 graves waited, patient and solemn. He promised them and himself that he would honor their choice, that he would ensure Riverside became a place where memory mattered, where dignity was respected, and where courage was never forgotten. If you want to follow the continuation of Riverside Plantation's story, subscribe to the channel, share this story with others, and leave your thoughts in the comments. Part 8 will reveal the consequences of confronting the past directly, the hidden tensions that surface when memory meets daily life, and the ways the living carry the weight of decisions made long ago in that summer of horror and courage. Part 8. The night came to Riverside Plantation with a heaviness that pressed against the walls of the main house. Lanterns flickered, casting long shadows across the floors, and the magnolia grove at the edge of the fields seemed to hum with memory. 14 graves lay in silence, but their presence was felt by everyone who lived and worked on the property. They were a reminder that the past never truly sleeps, that choices and courage leave echoes that ripple through generations. Samuel Brennan walked toward the grove as the sun sank behind the horizon. His heart was heavy with the knowledge of what Ruth had shared, and the weight of responsibility pressed upon him. This was no longer about cotton, profit, or the day-to-day operations of the plantation. This was about acknowledging history, facing the consequences of memory, and confronting truths that had been buried in fear and silence. He stopped at the first patch of bare earth, tracing its outline with his fingers. Joseph, a man who had loved music, who had found small moments of joy even in suffering. He whispered the name, feeling the weight of courage and the quiet dignity of someone who had chosen the impossible over surrender. Ruth appeared behind him, her steps soft against the grass. She leaned on her walking stick, her eyes clear and unwavering. "Samuel," she said, "there are things that must be faced. Not all will be easy. Not all will be understood. But every living person here must confront what it means to carry memory." Samuel nodded. "I am ready," he said, though he felt a chill run through him. The following morning, he called a meeting of the adult workers. He had spent weeks listening, observing, learning, and now he needed to act. He could feel the tension in the air, the careful silence of people who had been taught to fear attention, to hide their thoughts, to survive by erasing themselves. "We cannot ignore what happened here," he said. "We cannot pretend the past did not shape our lives." The summer of 1850 was a moment of terrible choices, of suffering beyond measure, and of courage that should never be forgotten. I want to honor that courage. I want Riverside to be a place of respect, where every person matters. There was silence at first. Some eyes were wary, some skeptical, some full of quiet hope. Ruth stood nearby, watching, her face unreadable but attentive. Samuel continued, explaining small changes he intended to make: safer working conditions, access to water and shade, proper medical care, and the acknowledgement of history in the simple act of remembrance. The response was cautious at first. Joseph's widow nodded quietly. Diana's daughter listened with wide eyes. Marcus shifted, unsure how to respond. But slowly, small gestures of acceptance began to emerge. Conversations started. Stories were shared. Memories of the summer were no longer hidden entirely in silence. Eleanor continued her visits to the grove, her childlike presence bridging past and present. She laid flowers on the bare earth, spoke the names aloud, and listened as Ruth shared the stories of the people who had been buried there. These small acts of remembrance created a sense of connection, a living memory that could not be ignored. Margaret, still uneasy, observed from a distance. She did not fully understand the significance of the grove or the impact of these actions. She feared that opening the past could bring unrest. But even she could not deny the subtle changes in Riverside. Workers moved with slightly more ease, laughter returned in whispers, and the plantation seemed to breathe more freely. Yet the acknowledgement of the past brought challenges. Some of the younger workers tested the limits of Samuel's promises, unsure if he truly meant the words he spoke. Others remained guarded, the echoes of trauma still shaping their movements, their conversations, and their trust. Samuel navigated these tensions carefully, realizing that confronting history required patience, humility, and vigilance. One evening, as a summer storm approached, Samuel returned to the grove alone. The first drops of rain fell on the magnolia leaves, the smell of wet earth filling the air. He knelt beside the graves, feeling the soil, the memory, and the courage it held. 14 lives had ended together, a collective act of defiance against a world that had denied them dignity, and now the living were tasked with remembering, honoring, and ensuring such choices were never required again. Ruth approached in the rain, her shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders. "Samuel," she said quietly, "history is not just about the past. It is about the living, about what you do with what you learn. You cannot protect everyone from memory, but you can guide them to respect it, to carry it without being destroyed by it." Samuel looked at the graves, at the magnolias swaying in the storm, and felt the weight of truth. Riverside was not just land, not just a plantation. It was a testament to courage, to choice, and to memory. And it was his responsibility to ensure that the living honored the dead and learned from their sacrifice. The storm passed, leaving the grove damp and glistening in the early morning light. Samuel began to walk back to the main house, feeling the first true sense of purpose since he had arrived. Change was slow, and the past was heavy, but Riverside was moving forward, guided by acknowledgement and respect. If you want to see how Riverside Plantation continues to confront its past and the challenges that arise when memory meets daily life, subscribe to the channel, share this story with others, and leave your thoughts in the comments. Part 9 will reveal the deep consequences of facing history, the tensions that resurface when truth is acknowledged, and the courage required to continue honoring those who can no longer speak. Part 9. The first light of dawn at Riverside Plantation carried a strange stillness. Mist clung to the cotton fields and hung heavy in the magnolia grove. 14 patches of earth waited quietly, unmarked yet full of presence, as if they remembered everything. Samuel Brennan stood at the edge of the grove, lantern still in hand from the previous night, though the sun now spilled across the landscape. He had come to understand that memory was not passive. Memory demanded action, demanded recognition, demanded courage from the living. The past was not done with Riverside. That summer, that July, still whispered through the soil and the trees. And now, confronting it brought consequences Samuel had not yet anticipated. Ruth approached, her footsteps soft in the damp grass. "There is more," she said quietly. "More that you need to understand." Samuel nodded, feeling the weight settle more firmly in his chest. "I am ready," he said. Ruth's eyes scanned the grove, lingering on each bare patch of earth. "The people buried here," she said, "did not simply vanish. They left marks in ways that you may not see at first. Fear, courage, grief, defiance, dignity. All of it lingers, not just in the soil, but in the living." Samuel looked around. "I see it in the workers," he said. "The way they move, the way they speak. They carry the past." "Yes," Ruth said. "And when the past is acknowledged, it tests you. It tests your patience, your judgment, your willingness to act with fairness. Not all are ready to face it. Not all accept the truth willingly." That afternoon, Samuel called a meeting with the adult workers again. He wanted to address the lingering tension, the unease that persisted even after weeks of effort. He explained that acknowledgement of history brought responsibility. He emphasized that Riverside was changing, but that change required careful attention and collective effort. Some nodded quietly, others remained silent, cautious. Some eyes flicked toward the grove as if seeking permission or guidance from the spirits buried there. Samuel understood that confronting history was not simple. The echoes of courage and tragedy were strong, and not everyone was ready to hear them fully. Meanwhile, Eleanor continued her visits to the grove. Her small hands placed flowers on each patch of earth, her eyes wide with understanding beyond her years. She asked questions that adults hesitated to voice, and Ruth answered with care, telling her stories of each person buried beneath the magnolias. Joseph's songs, Diana's braids, Marcus's carvings, Anna's remedies, Grace's bravery. Each story brought the dead back into memory, gave them life in the hearts of the living. Yet tensions arose unexpectedly. Margaret, still uneasy, observed Eleanor's visits and Ruth's influence with suspicion. She feared the past would unsettle the household, disrupt the order she believed necessary. But she could not deny that the plantation was calmer, that workers seemed more willing to engage, that Riverside ran more smoothly than it had under Dunmore's harsh rule. Samuel, aware of the subtleties, worked carefully to maintain trust. He consulted with Henry and Ruth about each interaction, listening to their advice and learning the hidden language of trauma and resilience. He realized that authority was not simply about command. It was about respect, acknowledgement, and the willingness to act with understanding. One evening, as the sun dipped low, Samuel returned to the grove alone. The air smelled of damp earth and magnolia. He knelt beside the graves, speaking the names aloud. Joseph, Diana, Marcus, Anna, Grace. He tried to imagine the courage it had taken for them to choose dignity over survival. The weight of their choice pressed against him, a reminder that history demanded recognition and action from the living. Ruth joined him, her face shadowed by the last rays of sun. "Samuel," she said, "there is another consequence of memory. The living carry it as carefully as the dead carried courage. It can inspire, yes, but it can also awaken fear, doubt, and unrest. You must guide them," she said, "or the weight will overwhelm them." Samuel understood. The past was not a story to be told lightly. It was a living force, shaping the present and future. And now the responsibility was his to channel it, to honor it, and to ensure that Riverside became a place of dignity, memory, and courage. In the following weeks, small changes became visible across the plantation. Work was more orderly but humane. Conversations began to flow where silence had ruled. Eleanor's flowers on the graves became a symbol, a visible acknowledgement that memory mattered, and that respect for those buried beneath the magnolias was essential. Yet shadows lingered. Some workers resisted change quietly. Some old habits persisted. Samuel realized that confronting history was a process, not a single act. The weight of the past would continue to test him and everyone at Riverside. It would demand vigilance, courage, and compassion. That night, Samuel stood once more in the grove. The magnolia trees swayed in the wind, the bare patches of earth silent but full of presence. 14 graves, 14 lives, 14 choices. And now the living carried the echoes of their courage. He promised to honor them, to guide the living with understanding, and to ensure that Riverside became a place where memory was never forgotten. If you want to see the final chapter of Riverside Plantation and learn how the legacy of courage, choice, and memory shapes the future, subscribe to the channel, share this story with others, and leave your thoughts in the comments. Part 10 will reveal the resolution of Riverside's haunted history, the lessons learned from confronting the past, and the way the living carry the weight of those who came before. Part 10 Final Part. The night air at Riverside Plantation was heavy, but it carried something new. Not the suffocating tension of fear, not the silence of avoidance, but the quiet weight of understanding and the possibility of resolution. The magnolia grove waited, its shadows long and reverent, guarding the 14 graves that had held the secrets of a terrible summer. Samuel Brennan stood at the edge of the grove, lantern in hand, his eyes tracing the bare patches of earth. 14 lives had ended here in the summer of 1850, a single night that had altered the course of Riverside forever. 14 acts of courage, acts of choice, acts of defiance against a world that had denied dignity to the enslaved. He felt the responsibility settle over him like a mantle. Ruth appeared silently, her walking stick tapping softly against the earth. "Samuel," she said, "tonight you will see the full measure of what it means to remember." Samuel nodded. "I am ready," he said, though a knot of apprehension tightened in his chest. Eleanor ran ahead, her small hand clutching a bouquet of wildflowers. She had learned to honor the grove, to place the flowers carefully, and to speak the names aloud. Joseph, Diana, Marcus, Anna, Grace. Each name carried a story, each story a reminder that courage and dignity could not be erased. That evening, Samuel gathered the adult workers. They assembled quietly in the clearing near the magnolias. Lanterns flickered, casting light on faces that held wariness, curiosity, and hope. Samuel began to speak. "We are here to honor those who came before us," he said. The summer of 1850 tested the limits of humanity, and 14 people made choices that demanded courage. They chose dignity in a world that denied it to them. We cannot change the past, but we can ensure it is remembered. We can ensure their courage shapes our future. The workers listened, the weight of memory pressing on each of them. Ruth watched silently, her eyes reflecting pride, sadness, and the quiet knowledge that the story had been waiting for someone willing to hear it fully. Samuel continued, explaining the changes he had already implemented and his plans for the future. Safe working conditions, respect for life, acknowledgement of history. He emphasized that Riverside would no longer be a place where fear dictated action or silence was required to survive. As he spoke, the workers began to nod, small gestures of acceptance that grew into quiet murmurs of agreement. Some eyes glistened with tears. Some hands clenched in acknowledgement. The past was being recognized, its weight shared rather than hidden. Eleanor stepped forward, her small voice carrying across the clearing. "I brought flowers for everyone," she said. "For those who lived and those who are gone." She laid the bouquet gently on the first bare patch of earth, repeating the names aloud. Joseph, Diana, Marcus, Anna, Grace. One by one, she placed flowers on each grave, a living act of remembrance. Ruth knelt beside her, whispering additional names, stories, and memories. The workers joined slowly, each adding a flower or a whispered word, creating a living memorial that transformed the grove into a place of recognition and reverence. Samuel felt a weight lift slightly from his chest. He realized that honoring the dead was also a release for the living. Riverside had been haunted by secrecy, fear, and unspoken grief, but now the act of remembrance allowed healing to begin. The past could never be undone, but its power to oppress could be diminished by acknowledgement, courage, and compassion. That night, under the magnolias, the plantation felt different. The wind still moved through the trees, but it carried not just memory but a sense of possibility. The workers returned to their cabins with a quiet peace. Eleanor slept with dreams full of the stories she had helped preserve. Samuel and Margaret stood on the porch, looking out at the grove, understanding for the first time that Riverside's future depended not on crops or profit, but on courage, memory, and moral responsibility. Over the following months, the changes at Riverside deepened. Workers felt safer, more willing to engage. Conversations flowed more freely, trust was gradually rebuilt, and the plantation operated with a sense of dignity and humanity that had been absent for decades. The Magnolia Grove became a place of reflection and teaching, where stories were shared, and history was honored. Ruth continued to guide both the living and the young Eleanor, passing down knowledge, wisdom, and the importance of remembrance. Samuel understood that his role was not only to manage the plantation but to steward the moral lessons embedded in its soil. Every decision he made carried the weight of history and the responsibility to honor courage and choice. One evening, Samuel returned alone to the grove. Lantern in hand, he walked between the 14 graves, feeling the presence of those who had lived and sacrificed. He knelt and whispered the names, promising that Riverside would remember, that their courage would not be forgotten, that their dignity would be acknowledged forever. Ruth joined him, placing her hand lightly on his shoulder. "You have done what few could," she said. "You have faced history, acknowledged the past, and guided the living to carry it with respect. Remember this: memory is a living thing. Nurture it, and it will shape the future." Samuel nodded, understanding fully for the first time that Riverside was more than a plantation. It was a testament to courage, choice, and the enduring strength of human dignity. The land, the trees, the soil, the people all bore witness to the past and the hope for the future. If you want to see more stories that explore hidden histories, forgotten courage, and the lessons of memory, subscribe to the channel, share this story with others, and leave your thoughts in the comments. Riverside Plantation's story is complete, but its lessons live on, reminding us that courage, choice, and respect for life shape every generation that follows.